I want to start with a question. When was the last time you heard somebody who was genuinely excited about the future? And when I say that, I'm not talking about, excited for a new car or going on a vacation. I mean, genuinely excited and optimistic about the direction that society is moving. Because when I think back to being a kid in the 90s and the 2000s, I felt like that kind of optimism was normal. You know, generally people just assumed things were going to get better. The future wasn't viewed as some giant source of uncertainty. I feel like it was more viewed as an opportunity. The expectation that technology would continue to improve our lives. And I'm not saying that it hasn't, but, or the expectation that the economy would continue to grow and that the next generation would just be overall better off than the last. I feel like that was the environment that a lot of us millennials were raised in. And yes, I'm a millennial. I'm 40 years old. So, but anyways, you guys have heard it. We were all told to work hard, get good grades, go to college, get a good job, buy a house, start a family, blah blah blah. And we were sold that shit so hard. But nobody back then presented that roadmap as a gamble. Like I guess it just felt like more common sense than anything back then. And it was just, follow the plan and things would work out. And I guess there was some kind of unspoken deal that if you do that, everything will be all right. And I'm not saying that it didn't turn out okay for some people, because for some people it did, but I think for the overwhelming majority, it hasn't. But back then, I mean, honestly, when we were being told all that, there were plenty of reasons to believe it. The internet was brand new, and early internet was awesome. That was when it actually felt like the world was opening up. For millennials, the internet wasn't something that we inherited. We watched it arrive. We got to see it in the beginning. And, we remember dial-up, we remember AOL, and I mean, I remember the first time you could get on the internet and instantly find questions to all your answers. And, Google, Wikipedia, that shit back then was awesome. I mean, that was when the internet when it felt hopeful, and I guess it actually felt creative. You could spend hours exploring random websites, forums, communities built by people who genuinely were passionate about something and just wanted to share that with other people. Back when it didn't feel like every interaction online was being optimized or monetized or tracked just to be fed into some algorithm. Even social media felt completely different in the beginning. Back then, I mean, social media was messy but it actually felt like it was connecting people. Whereas today, I feel like social media does a lot more alienating than it does connecting. But I remember the overall feeling about technology back then was that it was making life better. But then I think reality really started to show in 2008, and I think that's when a lot of the smoke and mirrors started to vanish and people started to see things for what they really are. That financial crisis didn't just damage the economy. I think it damaged a lot of people's trust in the system. So many people, friends I went to high school with, were just graduating college, and they were all going into terrible job markets. A lot of people's careers stalled. A lot of them ended before they even began. Companies were laying people off left and right, and there were entire industries that you thought were stable but they all just turned into a big mess, you know? And I think for the first time back then, a lot of people really started asking questions that they hadn't really considered asking before. You know, what if the roadmap to life that we were sold was all bullshit? Because up until then, you know, most millennials weren't rejecting the system, and you know, at least not in my experience, they weren't. A lot of the people I grew up with just felt like, you know, following the roadmap was the way. And I think so many people believed it back then. You know, we were doing exactly what we'd been told to do. And then suddenly, you know, found themselves buried under, you know, student loans, struggling to find jobs or delaying home ownership and wondering why the future looked nothing like what they'd been promised. So I guess 2008, I guess that's when that shift really started. You know, not just economically, but culturally and psychologically. You know, the confidence started disappearing. And I guess if you know, just a little proof that things really have changed since then, just compare like normal life, I guess, in the mid 2000s to the early to mid 2000s. You know, because I remember back then, I remember being like 22 years old, and I had just had a baby. I was still active duty in the army. So 22, 23, I don't know. I think I was in E4 then. I might have just been promoted to E5. I don't really remember. But my wife didn't work, and I was, like I said, I don't know, I was making 40K a year, 45 tops, but I guess we'll just call it 40 grand a year. And I remember I was able to pay my mortgage, my 2 car notes, groceries, bills, insurance, all of that. And we still had a little bit extra to go out and do stuff on the weekends every now and then. But at the time, that just felt normal, you know, because a lot of people were able to do that on, you know, that kind of income. But looking back, it's hard to believe that things were so much easier with less effort. But now, I mean, I'm older, I make more money, I have more skills, I work even harder, but I still feel stuck. And I know I'm not the only one that feels like they're in that same position. And it's not like my standard of living has changed drastically since then. Like, my lifestyle's pretty much the same, but it feels like every day's a constant struggle to just maintain. I mean, today people are making significantly more money on paper, but they feel like they're constantly playing catch up. And I know many people feel like they're in that same position. And we all know why, because, you know, housing has exploded, groceries, insurance, utilities, like everything basic to living, it's the prices of just, they're getting to the point where I feel like they're unsustainable for a lot of people. And that's not me just being nostalgic, it's just me pointing out a fact. You know, 15, 20 years ago, the dollar went a lot further than it does today. And I know a lot of people are going to think I'm being nostalgic because millennials love their nostalgia. But I think there's a reason why we do, because we remember when things were simpler and easier and people didn't feel like they were constantly at each other's throats. I mean, but that's the reality for a lot of people anymore. And a lot of the younger generations are growing up watching all this bullshit happen. And I think that's why their worldview is just so much different than ours. You know, because when millennials were young, you know, the future was usually discussed with excitement. But when you look at Gen Z and Gen Alpha and how they see the future, I think a lot of them just see nothing but, you know, rising costs, economic uncertainty, political instability, the social media addiction, and I think a lot of them are even wondering if there's going to be jobs for them because of AI. So, I mean, their questions are a lot more different than the questions that we had. I don't think a lot of them are asking, what amazing opportunities the future is going to bring. I think a lot of them are more asking questions like, whether or not they're ever going to be able to afford a home. Asking whether or not the systems around them can even be trusted anymore. And honestly, I mean, I don't blame them, because trust in institutions, government, corporations, the media, all that trust has been doing nothing but declining, and for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, maybe more. That old idea that if you just follow the roadmap and everything works out, that old roadmap, it just feels increasingly disconnected from reality anymore. And we know it. I think a lot of the younger generations look at that advice and they see it for what it is. They think it's bullshit, and they probably think we're stupid for ever believing it. But for previous generations, those steps, that old roadmap, I mean, that oftentimes led to somewhere predictable. And we see today that people can do everything right and they're still struggling with affordability and debt and just uncertainty. And I think that's a lot of the reason why the younger generations just tend to be a lot more skeptical. They're not cynical for no reason. They have every right to be cynical. They're just responding to the world that they inherited. Which I guess brings me back to my original question is, were we the last generation to be raised on hope? The last hopeful generation. And I'm not trying to say that the younger generations aren't hopeful. I think they're far from it, I guess. I think they're definitely a lot more adaptable and resilient in some ways, I guess that's a whole nother video. But I mean, the younger generations, they're definitely finding new ways to navigate a world that looks very different from the one millennials were raised in, but that's because they have no choice, But I do think millennials might have been the last generation raised during a period when, widespread optimism about the future was just an everyday normal default setting. The last generation raised to believe that progress was just inevitable. But maybe that belief was always, a little naive. And looking back, yeah, that shit was naive. Because we all know that nothing in life is guaranteed. Except for death and taxes. We all know that's the only guarantee we can expect out of life. But millennials, we experienced that whole transition in real time, and we grew up during the optimism, and then we became adults during all the bullshit and uncertainty. And I think that's why our generation feels a little bit different. Most of the younger generation today, I think a lot of them grow up wondering if we're headed for a dystopian future where every move they make is going to be tracked and analyzed, and wondering if every damn thing in life's going to turn into some subscription. Because it feels like that's where everything's headed. But anyways, tell me your thoughts. I would love to read them.